Hey, how's it going, guys? This is Max here from Deale Development, and today we're going to start going over the very basics of CSS. So if you have not yet learned any HTML, then I would highly advise you to go over to my HTML for Absolute Beginners Part 1 and 2 video series, as basic knowledge of HTML would be the only prerequisite for this course. So, with that out of the way, I hope you guys are very excited to start making your web pages look really great, and let's jump right in and start learning CSS. So before we get started, I just want to encourage you guys to go over to this W3 Schools website. It's w3schools.com, and check out their section on CSS. They've got extremely useful stuff here. You can learn all the different CSS properties and values you can use, and they've got examples of everything, and you can take quizzes and even get a little certification. So I think you guys are going to be using this website all the time for referencing. But with that out of the way, let's get started with the course. Okay, cool. So let's get started. On the desktop, I'm going to make a new folder by right-clicking and saying New Folder, and I will call this CSS_basics_1 and enter. Then we can right-click and open this folder with VS Code. Right, we can exit this welcome screen, and we're going to make a new file also called CSS_basics_1.html. Enter. Let's use the exclamation mark and hope it works. Fantastic, we have our boilerplate. And for the title, CSS Basics 1. Just like that. Cool. And the first thing I'm going to be teaching you guys about CSS is just exactly how to implement CSS. And there are 3 basic ways how to do this. So let's just zoom in a bit here. And inside the body, let's just make a couple of things. Let's make H1 our website. Let's make H2 it is great, and let's make a H3 we love it. Right, so we have 3 elements, 3 headings, an H1, an H2, and an H3. So let's go ahead and open this up with Live Server. Cool, so we have our web page open here on the right, and we have our 3 headings, our H1, H2, and H3. And the first method of implementing CSS that I will show you is called Inline Css. And the way that we do this is right after the element in question, we can put a space and then add a style attribute. And that could be equal to some inverted commas, and you can simply put CSS properties right in here. So this is called Inline Style. And I need to mention that this is not necessarily the best practice on how you usually use CSS on your web pages. The best way to do it is actually with an external style sheet, which we will explain in just a second. So to show you inline styling, I'll just put a simple color red CSS property to this H1 element, and you can see that the H1 turns red, just like that. So that is inline styling. You add a style attribute right onto your HTML element, then you can simply add your CSS properties right in there, and you can separate them with a semicolon just like that. So like I said, you don't really want to use inline styling because basically it just becomes a complete mess if you keep adding inline styling everywhere on your web page. And the best way to do it is in fact to use an external style sheet. But before we go over external style sheets, I will first show you how to do an internal style sheet. So the way that we do this is in the head of our document, our HTML document, you can simply add a style tag. So that's style and enter with Emmet. So inside this style tag, we can apply CSS properties to all of our elements inside our body. And this style tag will correlate to this specific HTML document. So if I target the H2 over here, and I set the color to blue, and I save and go back, you can see that our H2 has now become blue. So this is internal styling, and it can be quite useful, but like I said, most of the time you're going to be using an external style sheet, which I will explain right now. So the way in which we implement external style sheets is as such. We need to first of all make a new file called, and this is a very common file name to call your main style sheet CSS file, simply style.css, and that extension will of course tell this file that it is indeed a CSS file. Now inside this external style sheet, which is of course inside this root directory that we're working in, we can now target the H3 right over here, and let's set the color of this to orange. And if we go back to our web page, you can see that nothing has happened yet. And this is because we need to tell our HTML document exactly where this external style sheet is. And the way that we do this is in the head of your HTML document, you need to make a link tag. And you can see automatically emit will cause the rel attribute, which essentially just tells the element that this is the type of file that this link should be associated with, is in fact a CSS style sheet. And you can see it also has an href attribute, much like an anchor tag's href attribute, which we learned in the HTML course. And the way that we link the style document to our HTML document, we simply put a slash there, and you can simply push enter right here, and that will choose our style.css as our main style sheet. So you can see we changed the color of the H3 to orange over here. So if we go back, you can see that our H3 is now orange. And like I said, external style sheets are by far the most clean and most effective way that you are going to want to style your real-life websites. So now that we have learned how to implement CSS into our web pages, the next thing we need to know is how exactly are we going to select each element on our web page. And in order to illustrate this, I'm just going to make a couple more things down here. I will make a div with an H2 that says blog host 1, then a paragraph with some dummy text. Then I will just copy this div right over here with this content, and let's say this is the footer of the website, and let's just make this a little bit smaller just for some variation. So how exactly would we target these specific elements? Well, over here in our style tag, our internal style tag, which I will just work in for now for the sake of learning, you can see that in our internal style tag, we have already set this H2's color to blue, right? And you can also see that we have two more H2's in this div and in this div. So if I go back to our web page, you can see that all of our H2's are now blue. So if you simply target the element on its own, just like this, the CSS style sheet will assume that you want to change the properties of every single one of those elements, right? But what happens if you don't want to change the color of every single H2? What if you just want to change one of them? Well, this is exactly where classes and IDs come in very handy. we have this div over here as blog post 1. If we give this div an ID that says blog post 1, and we give this div over here the ID of main footer, now we can target these separate divs using these IDs. So let's go ahead and do just that. So remember the way that we targeted the h2 elements, remember this means all the h2 elements, is simply by putting h2 just like that. So that is all the h2 elements. If we want to target an ID in our style sheet, we simply use the hash symbol and then the name of the ID in question. So that would be blog post 1. Right, so let's change the background color of this to aqua. Let's just have a look. And you can see that our blog post 1 div with the ID of blog post 1, its background color has been changed. And that is because we specifically set this div to have this ID. Right? And let me show you something else quickly. What we can do underneath this, if I say hash symbol blog post 1, and then I put directly next to it an h2, just like this, what this means is any h2s that are direct children of this element. So that will target only this h2, right? So let's just have a look at that quickly. If I change this h2's color to brown and have a look, you can see that our blog post 1 h2 has become brown. So that is a very, very useful thing to know in CSS. You can simply target whatever ID you've selected, and then whatever elements straight after that will be the direct children of that element. So very useful stuff to know. Now, one other very useful thing to know is that you can use multiple selectors to apply the same set of style rules to elements. And in order to illustrate this, let me just delete what we've done here. And let me target again the blog post 1 ID, then separated with simply a comma. I will also target the main footer ID. So that is multiple selectors simply separated with a comma. So let's try change the background color here to green. Let's just have a look. And you can see that both of these elements have both turned green because we have used both selectors on one single CSS declaration. So that is also extremely useful. So we've learned how to select regular HTML elements like the H2 over here. You simply just H2 and that is that. We've learned how to select IDs by simply using the hash symbol and the name of the ID in question. So how would we target an element that has a class? Well, these paragraphs look like a great candidate for elements that could have classes. So I'll give this paragraph a class of lead. Then I'll also give this paragraph a class of lead, just like that. So you can see that both of these paragraphs have the lead class applied to them. And the way that we target classes in our CSS is simply with a dot right before the name of the class. So the way that we would target these paragraphs is just simply dot lead. and open up the curly braces. So let's change the font size for a change to 30 pixels. And let's have a look. And you can see that both of the paragraphs now have much bigger font. So that is how you would target classes in your CSS. And the same rules apply, of course, for the multiple selectors and everything else. So let's just have a look at the general structure of CSS syntax. So of course in our style sheets we're going to be targeting multiple elements and having many properties as well as values for our CSS. So remember we learned about selectors, we've got classes, we've got normal elements as well as IDs. So over here you have your selector, then after the selector you have the opening curly brace, and right at the end is the closing curly brace. And inside here is where we put all of the properties we need to render for this selector, right? So you can see over here, this is the CSS property in question. So color, that is a property, and green, that would be the value, the CSS value. So it's properties and values. And the way that we separate these is with a colon in between. So that is the property and value separator. So you can have as many of these as you want in every single opening and closing curly bracket. And the way that we separate our declarations for our CSS is by using a semicolon. Cool, so the next thing that I would like to introduce to you guys is something called the Web Developer Tools. And the way that we open this up in the Chrome browser is with Shift, Control, and I. And this will open automatically our JavaScript console, which we will not use in this course. But in this course, we will be definitely looking at the Elements tab. So if you go over to the Elements tab, you can see that I'm on the Wikipedia website right now. And over here in our Elements tab is where we can view the source HTML for every single web page on the internet. So let's just go ahead and go into Wikipedia. And let's just click on some random article. And you can see in our DevTools Elements tab, we have the entire HTML source code of this web page. And notice when I expand each div here, and you hover and click on each div in the Elements tab, you can notice that the element will be highlighted on the web page. So it's very useful for trying to do CSS debugging and stuff like that. And you can see this H1 over here. You can see the ID, the class, and everything like that. And you can even double click here, and I can change this title to just like that. Now, of course, this does not actually change the actual source code of this web page, and it is only changed on your local machine over here, as the dev tools are used for just that. They are tools for debugging and fixing problems with your CSS and your HTML. And if you look down here, we also have a Styles tab. So as well as changing the HTML and playing around with all the different things over here, we can also change the CSS values. So if we change this font weight to bold and enter, you can see that the font weight of this H1 becomes bold. However, if I refresh the page, you can see that everything has gone back to normal. So like I said, the dev tools are only used for debugging and playing around with things on your local machine. And as a web developer, you are definitely going to be using these developer tools all the time, as well as the JavaScript console. But for this course, all we need to focus on is this Elements tab, and of course the Styles tab over here. And some other things you can do with the dev tools, you can customize over here. You can put them at the bottom like this. Change the height and the width. You can put it on the side. I usually like to have it on the right side, as you can play around with the width of the screen just like this. And that is very useful when you're working on responsive design, which is a little bit beyond the scope of this course, but it's also very useful to know. Cool, so now that we have talked about the Chrome developer tools and you've got a quick little introduction there, I'd just like to take a second to talk about fonts on your web pages. So in general, you have two overlying font families, and these are serif fonts and sans serif fonts. And the difference between the two is basically just these little ends over here. So you can see these are very curved at the end, and sans is just a straight line kind of thing going on. So basically, in general, you're going to want to use sans serif over serif usually, just because they look a lot cleaner on web pages, and this style of font has more of a formal feel, if you ask me. So in general, you're going to use sans serif fonts, and I will talk about font families a little bit more right now. So we're back over on our web page, and I'd like you to notice that the default font here is indeed a serif font, like we just explained. And the default font for your web pages is always going to be this font, which is Times New Roman, which in my opinion does not look so great for your websites. So if we go to our style sheet here, and we're going to target the entire body of the HTML document. So this is very useful for setting global fonts and global stylings in general, so definitely keep that in mind. So I'm going to be showing you the font family property, and you can see over here we've got a huge list of all the default fonts that come with VS Code. And these are what we call web safe fonts. And a very common web safe font is this Arial font. And you can see actually we have two more afterwards. And what this basically means is it is a font stack. And all that really means is it's going to look for Arial first. If for some reason it can't find that, it'll use Helvetica, which is also a quite nice font, by the way. Otherwise, it'll just use a sans serif. So let's go ahead and set this font stack to our body of our web page, and let's go back. Now this font looks a little better, although everything still looks completely ridiculous. So a couple more properties we can set on the font. We've got the font weight. We can do light, lighter, bold, or bolder. So that is bold, that is bolder, and this is lighter. So you're going to want to use a variation of these when you're designing your web pages. Generally headings need to be bold and paragraphs need to be lighter, but you use a mix of the two to create almost an artistic feel with the fonts. And what else? We've got the font size, of course. So we've got these general kind of large, larger, medium, small, smaller, extra large. We can use those just for quick font changes. But in general, you're going to want to use pixels or rem units or something like that. So that is how we change the font family default on our web pages in our CSS. And another thing we can do is we can go to fonts.google.com, and this is the Google Fonts website. And basically you can find whatever kind of font you want here. And we've got categories, so we've got serif, sans serif, display, handwriting, and monospace. So let's have a look at the sans serifs. And generally they're going to use all the kind of web safe fonts more towards the top. So it's good to choose one of these as your default because you know that it's a web safe font and you know it's going to look good. Some favorites are Leto, Roboto, Montserrat, and Poppins. And let me show you how exactly you incorporate this into your web pages. So let's say we want this Leto font right here. So we just click right over here on the font, Now you're going to see some different variations. Some are a lot thinner and some are a lot bolder. So you just choose the relevant style that you need. So over here you can select this style. And over here you have two options to incorporate this Google font onto your web page. You can either use a direct link inside the head of your HTML document, or you can use this @import syntax, which is right there in your CSS file. But make sure you put them right at the top, and I will show you how to do that right now. So just this little bit right here, so not the style tag. So we're going to Control C, we're going to copy that. And let's go to our style sheet. And right at the top of our style sheet, we're just going to paste that right in there. So we're importing straight from the Google APIs the Lato font. So we should be able to change this font family here to Lato. Let's have a look. There we go. Looking a little bit better, but still ridiculous. So one thing I would definitely encourage you guys to do is go over to the w3schools.com website, which I mentioned before, and just check out their section on CSS fonts. Some interesting stuff over here. And like it says right over here, font selection is indeed important. Choosing the right font has a huge impact on how the readers experience a website. So this is just kind of something you have to experiment with yourself, and you'll kind of see for yourself what works and what doesn't. For example, like these Comic Sans kind of fonts, you'll pretty much never use. I mean, that's very kind of 2000s, 90s kind of stuff. So, like I said before, in general, the web-safe fonts are probably going to be your best bet. So we've successfully learned how to incorporate different fonts onto our web pages. We can either use these default VS Code fonts like the Arial, Helvetica, etc., etc., or we can go over to Google Fonts and use the import syntax to incorporate the font into our style sheet, or we can use the link tag in the head of our document. Both work exactly the same pretty much. So I just wanted to take a second to explain that these color values, you can notice that I hover over them, you can actually change them with this color selector right here. And that is very cool and very useful. And also notice that this value over here, this RGB value, that is important because that is actually a different color type. So you can notice as I change it, as I move this little circle around this color palette, the numbers are actually changing. And the reason for that is, you see, this part over here, these are reds. So this number represents reds, this number represents the greens, so it's the amount of greens essentially, and the maximum number that it can go up to is 255. So you can see a change as I move around this color wheel like this. So this is the second kind of color type we have. The first one is just a name of the color. So this is an example of that right here. So the background color is green. That's very simple. That's the name. We've got green. And we've got various different types of colors we can choose from. If we just say, for example, a letter, so H, we've got honeydew and hot pink. If we say P, we've got, what is that? Pale goldenrod, pale green, pale turquoise. You've got so many different variations of color names that you can choose from. And just by hitting a letter and checking them out, you can really have a lot of fun checking all of those out. So back to the RGB value. If I change this first value, which is the red, remember, if I change that to 255 and I leave the rest as 0, that means that this color is of course going to be red because 255 is the maximum, remember? And these two zeros represent green and then blue, and each of them is 0, so of course this color is going to be red, right? And if I wanted to add a little bit of green in there, let's just try 50. You can see that it changes just a little bit. Let's make it 150. Now it's become kind of orange. And let's try putting some blues in there and see what happens. So we've got kind of a paler version of that last color over there. So you can see that with these RGB values, you can really play around and get used to them, and you can really find a lot of great colors like that. So that's the second kind of color type that we have. That's RGB color type. So the first one is the name, and the second one is RGB. The third one is something called a hexadecimal, or just simply hex. And the way we represent hexadecimal color types is with a hash symbol. And it's actually the same kind of concept as the RGB. But instead of using it like the RGB values, we simply use a series of letters and numbers. And it's 6 to be precise, hence hexadecimal. And you can see that all zeros is going to be black. It's simply the same as if I were to say RGB. So RGB, and I put all zeros in here. So 0, 0, and 0. That is going to be the same thing. So let me explain that a little better. In a hexadecimal, this represents the red, these first two, and then these middle two represent the green, and the last two will represent the blue. So it's kind of the same thing, but in a much easier format. So one other fantastic resource that I'd like to show you guys is this website over here. It's called Color Hunt, and the URL is colorhunt.co. And basically you can browse through a bunch of different color palettes. And my point with this is that not all colors look good together, right? So it helps to have some assistance in this regard when choosing the general color layout for your website. And you'll get to learn over time that different colors basically give different feelings to your website. For example, the color yellow gives a real sense of urgency and importance, and it's a very eye-drawing color. So if you are designing a website where you really need to draw the user's attention to something, yellow would be a good choice. Purple is a color which represents kind of royalty and extravagance, and blue represents more sort of loyalty and trust. So very interesting stuff to know. And also I would definitely suggest that you don't use too many colors on your websites. So that's why this website is so great. You can simply come here and choose a color scheme, and you can see here when you hover over each color, you can see it gives you the hexadecimal value for each color. So you can see this one over here. If I click this, you can see it automatically copies it. And if I go back to my style sheet and I change the color of this H2, make sure you include the hash symbol, of course, because it's a hexadecimal value. So let's just take a look at that. You can see it changed to that color. And let's just see how it looks with the other colors from the same palette. So I believe it was this one. Yes. So if we take this color and we change this background color to that color, remember the hash symbol. And let's change this red as well to this color from the same palette. Let's put the hash symbol there. You can see that these colors kind of blend together. So in general, you want to keep your website confined to about 3, 4, or maximum 5 colors, I would say. And those colors definitely have to mesh together. And that's something you're just going to have to learn over time. But like I said, this Color Hunt website is a great place to get started with matching colors. Cool, so before we start talking about borders and backgrounds in CSS, I just wanted to mention that before, when we imported this Lato font, and we changed the font family to Lato. That was in the internal style sheet. And if you'll remember, we actually imported the Google font in the external style sheet. So this is obviously a mistake because this import syntax is only going to work in the exact style sheet where you need to use the font. So I've moved over this font family Lato property and value of the body into the external style sheet. And now you can see that the Lato font is successfully applied. So that is another important thing to remember. So let's get on now and learn about borders and backgrounds. So I've gone ahead and removed the styles that we've had before, and we do still have the same HTML content over here. So let's target this blog post 1 again. So that's the hash symbol and blog post 1. And if you'll remember, the way that we change the color of the font is with the color property. So if I say color here, and let's change it to a hexadecimal. And another thing I can mention with the hexadecimal values quickly, if you just leave 3 values that are all the same, it's going to assume that the rest of the values are the same as these values. So this would be 333, 333. And that's just kind of a darkish gray color that I like to use. So that's of course how we change the font color with simply the color property. And if we want to change the background color, that is simply the background color property. And you can also just use background, but we'll get to that in just a second. So let's choose something over here. Let's say 3, something like that. Kind of similar here. Remember, if you hover over, you can just choose a different color. So let's just choose something different. So we've changed our background color successfully of this ID. Let's just do the same thing for the other one, which is the main footer. So that's main footer, background color, and something random. Not too worried about colors at the moment. So let's also just do some practice over here and change this H2. Main footer, H2, remember? So that's that specific H2. Let's change the color of that to something else. That's a name this time. Cool, that's different. So that is background colors, very straightforward. And let's go over some different background properties. And in order to do this, I'm going to go over to this website that we looked at back in the HTML course, and that's unsplash.com. So I just want to find a nice random image. I'm just going to search for patterns. Patterns. So just random patterns. Lots of interesting stuff here. Let's take this one. So I'm just going to right click here and say copy image address. So I've copied the image address of that image. And let's change this background color property to simply background. And what you can do over here is you just say URL, and then inside these parentheses you can direct to an image file that will be displayed as your background for that specific CSS declaration. So if I paste in that image address and take a look, you can see it's changed to that image for the background. And we have various different background properties that we can change in order to have a different effect for these backgrounds. And you can see that this image is repeating horizontally, right? So if I wanted to change that, I could just say background repeat. So that is another property. And you can see the different options here. So you can repeat on the x-axis, you can repeat on the y-axis. But what I usually like to do, unless it's a kind of pattern that looks good when it's repeating is just do no repeat. So it's not repeating now, however, it doesn't fit. So how would we fix this? Well, we have a background size property. We've got auto, contain, and cover. So if we choose cover, you can see that the image stretches across the entire width of the element now. And just one more background property that I'd like to show you is the background attachment property. And we also have different options over here. If we set this to fixed, for example, that means that when you scroll up and down your web page, the image is going to stay fixed in the same place. So it kind of gives a pretty cool scrolling effect. So if we check it out, I think our web page is actually too small to illustrate this at the moment. So what we could do is give the body a height property. Let's just say something like 3000 pixels. So it's just a lot taller now. If we scroll up and down, you can see the effect that is given. And it's quite cool. However, I must say that you can't really see this black text over here. And that actually brings me to another very important design fundamental aspect. And that is contrast on your web pages. So you see how this black text is clashing with this background. You can't really read it, and that's because there is indeed black in the background. So let's try change the color of that text. So that's the footer, main footer, and the P element. Let's just change the color to something really bright. So it's definitely a bit easier to read, but it's still not ideal with the white. So if we gave the actual paragraph element a background color of black, that will contrast a lot better. So it's generally a very important concept is color and contrast, and it is definitely something that you're just going to have to experiment with and you will get better with over time. But just know that it's very important in design. So let's just take a second to go over borders in CSS. So we're targeting this main footer over here. And the way I usually do borders is all in one line. So the way we do that, and I'll show you that first. So we use the border property, and the first value we set is the width of the border. And the way we do this is using pixels. So if I say 10 pixels, that's the width of the border. The next property is going to be the style of the border, and we have different kind of border styles, which I'll go over in just a second. But one of them, and the most common, is simply a solid border, right? Then the third value that we use for the border is going to be the color. So if we say orange over here, take a look, our main footer now has a 10 pixel solid orange border. And let's just take away this solid value and see. So now the border has disappeared, and that is because when you do all the border properties in one line, you're going to have to use every value. So if we do them on a separate line, we can change the property individually instead of all on one line. So if we say border style, now we have our options. We've got dashed, dotted, double, groove. Let's do a dashed and have a look at that. So that's a dashed border. 10 pixels. If we change it to 5 pixels, a little bit thinner. Let's try one more. Let's try dotted. Let's just change the color to blue. So now it's 5 pixels dotted blue. And I'd also like to mention that you don't have to just do a border all around. You can do a border left, a border top, a border right, and also a border bottom. So if we do a border bottom here, we can do the same kind of thing. So if we say 20 pixels solid orange, our main footer now has a 20 pixels solid orange border, but only on the bottom, right? So let's just do one more border. Let's do a 3 pixel solid green, and I'd like to explain a property called border radius, and this essentially determines how round the corners of your border are going to be. And it works the same as the border property. So if I say 50%, that's generally going to make your border into a circle. So it looks a bit silly here because obviously this is quite a wide element. So we can change the width of our elements. So let's make it a lot smaller. So like 300 pixels. Little bit smaller, 200 pixels. So the background element has now become a circle, but the content is obviously overflowing because this paragraph is still a block level element. So the background is now a circle, but the font is obviously not contained. What we could try to do is use this overflow property and set that to hidden. And now it'll cut off the overflow of the text. So that's quite a useful property to know when you've got overlapping things and you just want things to be contained within their parent container. Something else we can do is text align. So if we text align everything to the center, that looks a little bit better. And you can also text align left, text align right. It's a very important property to get used to, and it's also a very important part of design, in fact. So let's just quickly play around with this blog post 1 over here. If I give this a width, and you can use different kind of measuring units for your widths. You can use pixels or percents generally. And if I give this a width of 50%, this blog post 1, it's going to be 50% of the entire web page. And something very important for positioning that I'll quickly show you. And we will get into margin and padding in just a little bit. If I set the margin property of this to 0, that's going to represent, first of all, 0 on the top and the bottom. And the second value is going to represent the margin on the left and the right of the element. So this is really important for positioning your elements. Usually if you say auto for the second value, it's going to move your element into the middle of your web page. And that is something you're going to be using all the time. And the reason it does this is because it's automatically detecting the margin on the left and the right of the element. So that's why it goes automatically in the middle. And then of course 0 margin on the top and bottom will cause no change. So with that in mind, let's go over margin, padding, and the box model right now. So I'm back over here on our lovely web page, and in order to illustrate the box model, I'd like to first of all explain that essentially every single element on your web page is indeed a box. So this is a box, this is a box, this is a box, this is a box, and even this is a box. But remember, we set the border radius to 50%, so hence it appears as a circle. So I'm going to bring up now the Chrome Developer Tools with Control-Shift-I, remember. And in our elements, you can see all our HTML. And over here in our Styles tab, you can see this is a diagram of the box model. And the box model is applied to every single element on your web page. So if I hover over this H1, you can see that we've got this orange around the element. And what that orange represents is the margin. So the margin, it is very important to understand that the margin is the outermost region of every single element. Then we've got the border, which can also have a different width. Then after the border is where we have padding. So padding would be the first kind of property that you want to give your elements space with. So first it's padding, then we've got the border, then we've got the margin, which is represented by the orange, right on the outside, right? So it can be quite confusing at first to differentiate between padding and margin, but with practice, as always with anything, you will definitely start to understand these things. And you can go right over here in your Chrome tools, and if I give this padding value here 100 pixels, you can see that padding has been added to that H1 over there. So if we choose this blog post one, notice, if you'll remember, we gave this element margin auto on left and right. So that's represented by that orange right over there. In fact, it's 200 on the left and right. So if we, for instance, gave it margin top of 1000 pixels and push enter, it pushes it down by 1000 pixels. So this is another illustration of how the Chrome developer tools are in fact very useful for playing around with your CSS, especially when you use this box model diagram over here where you can change these different values. Cool, so we're back over here in our internal style sheet, and I'm going to now show you guys how to apply margin and padding to your elements in your CSS. So if we go to this blog post one, let's just close up the dev tools. I'd first like to mention that by default, your browser actually applies a couple of margin and padding rules automatically. And that is the reason why this space over here exists and this space over here exists. And you might not always want this to be the case, because you are going to want to apply your own style rules in any way you want, right? And you don't want to be held back by default styles, padding and margin that you don't even know are there. And the way that we fix this, or not necessarily fix, but change it, I'd say, and you might not want to do this in every single scenario, but I usually do it. And the way we do this is by essentially just resetting the margin and the padding of every single element in the browser. And the way we do this is we use an asterisk as a selector, and that's just going to select literally everything. So we choose the padding of everything and set it to 0, and we choose the margin of everything and set it to 0. And the last thing we do, and this is of course optional, there's this box sizing property. And I'm definitely not going to get into this too much, but if we choose this border box value, what this basically does is it decides whether or not each element should include the border and the padding when it's calculating the width and the height of each element. So if we change it to this, it's not going to include the padding and the border on the width and the height calculations. So I prefer it like this personally. And if you go over to the W3 Schools website, you can read more about border box and box sizing. So as you can see, we've successfully reset the padding and the margin on all of our elements, and that's why everything is a lot closer together, right? So what if we wanted to give this h2 over here a little bit of margin in our CSS? So we are targeting that h2. No, we're not. Let's target that one. So blog post 1 and then the h2. So let's do some margin. Remember, if we just say margin and then we put in the value, so let's put in 2 rem and let's have a look at that. So this h1 over here, which we just applied the margin on all sides of 2 rems, and rems are basically multiples of 16. So 1 rem would be 16 pixels, and it's directly translated from the root of the document, rem units. And then you also have m units, which is just em. And those are translated also in multiples of 16, but these are from the parent element in question. So rems is from the absolute root, and m's are from the parent element, and multiples of 16. Anyways, so this blog post 1 h2, where we've set the 2 m's, you can see that the margin is only really visible on the bottom, and that's because the margin has indeed been applied. If I hover over this, you can see the orange on the outside of this blog post 1 h2. So that means the margin is being applied. However, you can't see it, of course, because this element over here only takes up so much space. However, if we were to change this to padding, then you would indeed see the change all around, because if you'll remember from the box model, the padding is the first thing that goes around the element, and the margin is right on the outside. So with the margin, we couldn't see the change in the parent element, which is the blog post 1 div. However, with the padding, this will change and it will be visible on the top as well. So that is very important stuff to know. So I'd like to just show you guys a couple of different ways that you can apply padding to your elements. So much like we did with the borders, we can say padding left, padding top, padding bottom, and padding right. And there's also some other ones here, but we won't get into those just yet. So let's do padding bottom, and let's set that to 4 rem on this h2 still. So let's just quickly comment that out and go back, and we can see the difference here. So the padding is being applied only to the bottom, right? There's a slight change there. So we can apply padding bottom, left, and right, and we can also do it in one line, just like we did with the borders. So let's say padding here, and just remember it goes top, right, bottom, and then left. So let's just do something else here. So let's choose this paragraph. Let's do margin here. So I'll do 50 pixels top, 150 pixels right, 200 pixels bottom, and 300 pixels on the left. So it's pretty random. Let's have a look. So notice the change here on the paragraph element. You literally can't see the text anymore because we've set so much random margin around it. So let's take that away from the paragraph and let's put it on the actual element itself. Let's have a look at that. So we won't be able to see that either because it's margin and it's on the outside, but if we change this to padding, notice how much bigger this element gets. So let's just play around with these values a little bit just to see some different ways we can set margin and padding. So remember, we can use two values. So 24 rem on top and bottom, and 12 rem on left and right. On this big footer thing, that's just going to make it enormously oval. Another thing we can do, of course, is just take away this and say 24 rem all around. So that'll just make it nice and even. So my point with this is to remember the different ways in which you can set your margin and your padding. You can do it with 4 values, so top, right, left, bottom. You can do 2 values, so that's top and bottom and then left and right, or you can just use 1 value such as this, which will work on the element all sides. And that works for margin as well as padding exactly the same way. Alright guys, so that is all the basics of CSS that we will be covering in this video. Well done for making it through the entire course. I'm sure it's a lot to take in, but it's very, very fun stuff to know, and as with anything, practice makes perfect. And I will definitely be seeing you in the near future for a more advanced CSS course. But until then, I just wanted to thank you genuinely again for watching, and please do subscribe to the Deale Development channel for some great free programming educational content. So until the next one, I will see you then. Thanks guys, and bye bye.